In the 1950s, Batman was a smiling deputized cop who fought aliens and zipped off to other dimensions. He was a respected civic leader, a father figure to Robin, and a hero who always played by the rules. Today, he's a grin-tormented figure who strikes fear into the hearts of criminals. He's a paranoid tactician who operates in the shadows, hunted by the very police he's trying to help. So how did DC Comics take their star hero from this ... to this? Well, the reason is a lot darker and more calculated than you might think. It's a story about censorship, creative rebellion, and a massive cultural shift that forced Batman to become the Dark Knight. This wasn't just a simple evolution. It was a series of deliberate, and often desperate, decisions made behind the scenes. This is the story of how Batman was broken, and then rebuilt, piece by piece, into the darker, more complex, and frankly, more enduring icon we know today. Section 1. The Golden Age and the Original Sin. To understand how Batman became the hero we know now, we first have to go back to the very beginning. When the character, then called the Batman, first showed up in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939, he wasn't exactly a hero. Not really. Created by artist Bob Kane and writer Bill Finger, this first version was a mysterious vigilante inspired by pulp characters like the Shadow. He was a dark avenger of the night. And this Batman had no problem with killing. In his earliest adventures, Batman was a brutal figure. He carried a gun, and he used it. He threw criminals off rooftops, and in one infamous panel, knocked a villain into a vat of acid, coldly saying, "A fitting end for his kind." This was a Batman born from the Great Depression, a force of swift, merciless, and often lethal justice. His mission was simple: a one-man war on crime, fueled by the murder of his parents. The stories were grim, atmospheric, and violent. They were, in a word, dark. This was his default setting, but that darkness didn't last long. A problem popped up almost immediately. As Batman's popularity exploded, leading to his own solo comic in 1940, the editors at DC got nervous. Was this violent Avenger really the right hero for the kids who were now buying his comics by the truckload? They decided the answer was no. The first big change was introducing Robin in 1940. The Boy Wonder was created specifically to lighten the mood, give Batman someone to talk to, and make the stories more kid-friendly. And it worked. Sales skyrocketed. But with Robin came a new editorial policy. A mandate was set. Batman should no longer kill or use a gun. Just like that, the grim Avenger was sanitized. The darkness was deliberately suppressed, covered up by boyish adventure and a new moral code. The character who started as a killer was now a sworn protector of life. This was the first calculated change, the first time DC actively stepped in to reshape their hero. The original Dark Batman was gone, replaced by a more marketable, parent-friendly version. But the shadow of what he once was would linger for decades, and the forces that sanitized him would soon return with a vengeance. Section 2. The Silver Age and the Comics Code Authority. So how did Batman go from a sanitized detective back to a dark Avenger? First, he had to become an absolute joke. And it all started with a book called Seduction of the Innocent. In 1954, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham published a book that sent a shockwave through the comic book industry. Seduction of the Innocent argued that comics were a direct cause of juvenile delinquency. Wertham's research has since been widely discredited, with evidence showing he manipulated his findings, but at the time, it caused a moral panic. Parents were terrified. The U.S. Senate even launched an inquiry into the industry. Wertham made some wild claims, but he took special aim at Batman. He argued that the relationship between Batman and Robin was a homosexual fantasy. Facing the very real threat of government regulation, comic publishers decided to regulate themselves. They formed the Comics Magazine Association of America and created the Comics Code Authority, or CCA. The CCA was basically a censorship board for the whole industry. While publishers could technically opt out, most major companies joined to ensure their comics could be sold on newsstands. Its rules were incredibly restrictive. Crimes could never be presented in a way that made you feel sorry for the criminal. Cops and government officials could never be shown in a way that disrespected authority. A rule that made Batman's entire existence as a vigilante a huge problem. Words like horror and terror were effectively banned from titles. Any hint of sex perversion, a coded term for homosexuality, was strictly forbidden. The effect on Batman was immediate and catastrophic. To steer clear of Wortham's allegations, writers were pushed to introduce female characters. Batwoman, Kathy Kane, was created in 1956 as a love interest for Batman. A few years later, in 1961, the original Batgirl, Betty Kane, was introduced as a sidekick for Robin. The stories themselves were scrubbed of anything remotely dark or serious. This was the birth of the campy, sci-fi hero of the Silver Age. Grim detective stories were replaced with bizarre adventures in space. Batman was no longer a shadowy vigilante. He became an officially deputized member of the Gotham City Police. His classic villains were sidelined in favor of aliens, magical imps like Batmite, and absurd sci-fi plots. This was the era of Rainbow Batman and Zebra Batman. The stories were light, silly, and completely disconnected from the characters' dark origins. This wasn't a creative choice. It was survival. DC Comics was terrified of the CCA. Any story that could be misinterpreted as dark or subversive was shot down. The result was a Batman that was safe, sanitized, and utterly ridiculous. The dark hero from 1939 was now a government-approved cartoon character. For nearly 2 decades, this was the Batman everyone knew. But this swing into the absurd would eventually create the pressure for an equally extreme swing back. Section 3. The Bronze Age and the Return to Darkness. By the late 1960s, Batman was a joke. The 1966 Adam West TV show, while a pop culture smash hit, had cemented the public's view of Batman as a goofy, campy character. Comic book sales were tanking. The character had become, as writer Dennis O'Neil put it, stale and outmoded. DC had a huge problem. Their flagship dark hero was a punchline. How could they possibly bring him back? The answer came from a new generation of creators who grew up with the original, darker version. In 1970, editor Julius Schwartz handed the Batman titles to writer Dennis O'Neil and artist Neil Adams, a team that would become legendary. Their mission was simple but revolutionary: bring Batman back to his dark roots. O'Neil and Adams systematically tore down the Silver Age silliness. They moved Batman out of the Batcave and into a penthouse in the city, cutting him off from that suburban comfort. They wrote Robin out of the series by sending him to college, letting Batman be a loner once again. And most importantly, they changed the entire tone. Their very first story together, The Secret of the Waiting Graves, was a gothic mystery that set the stage for everything that followed. O'Neill's scripts were moody, while Adams' art was gritty and realistic. For the first time in decades, Batman was shown as a fearful figure, a creature of the night who terrified criminals. The stories pivoted away from sci-fi and back to detective work, horror, and psychological depth. They brought back classic villains who had been forgotten, like Two-Face, and gave them a serious modern edge. They completely revitalized the Joker in a landmark story called The Joker's Five-Way Revenge, turning him from a harmless prankster back into a homicidal maniac. This story created the template for the modern Joker, a villain whose humor is terrifying. Perhaps their biggest contribution was a brand new kind of villain, Ra's al Ghul, introduced in 1971. Inspired by James Bond antagonists, Ra's was a global terrorist who challenged Batman not just physically, but philosophically. He didn't want to rob a bank. He wanted to cleanse the world. This added a whole new layer of moral complexity to Batman's universe. This wasn't just a change in story. It was a fundamental shift in the character's identity. The Bronze Age, from about 1970 to 1985, reflected the growing anxieties of the time fears about crime, corruption, and moral ambiguity. Comics were growing up, and readers wanted more sophisticated stories. The work of O'Neill and Adams was the turning point. They didn't just tell new Batman stories. They rescued the character from irrelevance and laid the foundation for the modern Dark Knight. They proved that a darker Batman was not only possible but necessary. And this was only the beginning. The 1980s would take the darkness they reintroduced and turn it into a cultural phenomenon. Section 4. The Modern Age and the Dark Knight solidified. The Bronze Age brought Batman back to the shadows. But the 1980s would chain him there. This was the decade that didn't just make Batman dark. It made darkness his defining trait. And it all began with 4 words: The Dark Knight Returns. In 1986, writer-artist Frank Miller unleashed a miniseries that completely redefined Batman. The Dark Knight Returns is about a 55-year-old Bruce Wayne who comes out of retirement to fight crime in a bleak, dystopian future. This was not the hero of the past. Miller's Batman was a brutal, borderline fascist figure, an anti-hero grappling with his own rage. The book was a massive success, and its influence was immediate. Along with Alan Moore's Watchmen, it kicked off the Dark Age of comics, a period defined by grim, psychologically complex stories. The campy Adam West version was officially dead and buried. DC Comics saw the success of Miller's dark vision and doubled down. After rebooting their universe with Crisis on Infinite Earths, they hired Miller to redefine Batman's origin. The result was 1987's Batman, Year One, which cemented the gritty, realistic tone, focusing on Bruce Wayne's trauma and Gotham's corruption. But 1988 was the year that truly sealed Batman's dark fate. It brought 2 of the most infamous stories in his history. First was Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. This graphic novel was a brutal psychological horror story, exploring the thin line between sanity and madness. To prove that one bad day can drive anyone insane, the Joker commits one of the most shocking acts in comics. He shoots Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, paralyzing her from the waist down. He then kidnaps and tortures Commissioner Gordon. The story was hugely controversial for its treatment of Barbara, with many, including Moore himself later, criticizing her being used as a plot device to traumatize the male characters. But its impact was undeniable. It proved that in Batman's world, the consequences were real and no one was safe. That same year, DC took that idea to its extreme with A Death in the Family. The second Robin, Jason Todd, wasn't very popular with readers. So, in a move that was part creative decision, part marketing gimmick, DC let the fans decide his fate. At the end of one issue, the Joker brutally beats Jason with a crowbar and leaves him in a warehouse with a bomb. The back of the comic had 2 1 to 900 numbers, one to vote for Jason to live and one for him to die. By a razor-thin margin of just 72 votes, the fans chose death. In the next issue, Batman arrived just in time to see the warehouse explode and pulled Jason's lifeless body from the rubble. The death of a Robin was a seismic event. It shocked readers and added a new tragic dimension to Batman. He wasn't just a hero who had lost his parents. He was now a mentor who had failed his son. This failure would haunt him for years, driving him deeper into darkness and paranoia. The 1-2 punch of The Killing Joke and A Death in the Family, built on the foundation of The Dark Knight Returns, was the point of no return. DC's direction was clear. Darkness sells. The mature, brutal stories were both critically acclaimed and commercially successful. The modern Batman, the brooding, tormented, and permanently scarred detective, was no longer just one interpretation. He was the interpretation. Section 5. The New Millennium and the Dark Multiverse. The 80s may have cemented Batman's darkness, but the modern era has explored its most terrifying corners. Now, the darkness isn't just an attitude or a tragic backstory. It's become a literal, cosmic force in the DC universe. This is the era of the Dark Multiverse. Introduced in the 2017 storyline Dark Knights, Metal, the Dark Multiverse is a shadow reflection of the main DC multiverse. It's an unstable, nightmarish realm made of dark matter, where every fear and every worst-case scenario becomes a fleeting, doomed reality. These worlds are broken from the start, destined to die. And at the center of this concept are twisted, evil versions of Batman. These Dark Knights are Batman from those nightmare worlds. There's the Red Death, a Bruce Wayne who stole the Flash's speed. The Drowned, a female Bryce Wayne who surgically altered herself to conquer the oceans. And most terrifying of all, the Batman who laughs at Bruce from a world where he finally killed the Joker, only to be infected by a toxin in the Joker S-Heart that turned him into a horrifying hybrid of the two. He has Batman's genius combined with the Joker's absolute sadism. These storylines push Batman's trauma to its absolute limit, exploring what happens when the hero himself becomes the source of the nightmare. So why this ultimate dark turn? It allows writers to take the question, what if Batman went too far? And provide 1,000 horrifying answers, reflecting our own modern fears about unchecked power. It also meets a consistent demand from audiences for more complex stories. The success of darker comics and Christopher Nolan's as grounded Dark Knight trilogy proved that people wanted a hero who truly struggled with the psychological toll of his crusade. Batman's story became the perfect way to explore trauma, morality, and the cost of justice in a broken world. From a gun-toting vigilante to a campy space adventurer, and all the way back to a grim detective haunted by loss, Batman's journey has been a long and twisted road. It was never a straight line. It was a series of reactions, a reaction to public panic, to censorship, to creative boredom, and finally, to us, the audience. DC Comics didn't just wake up one day and decide to make Batman dark. They were forced to make him light by the moral panic of the 1950s and the iron fist of the Comics Code. That sanitization created a hero so bland, he nearly faded away. So then, they were forced to make him dark again, driven by a new generation of creators and an audience that was hungry for more complex heroes. The success of O'Neill and Adams, the explosion of The Dark Knight Returns, and the shock of The Killing Joke and A Death in the Family weren't just stories. They were proof that darkness was Batman's destiny. The character's enduring appeal lies in that very darkness. He's a reflection of our own anxieties, but he's also a symbol of resilience. He shows us that it is possible to face unimaginable trauma and turn it into a force for good. Batman's darkness isn't just a style choice. It's the core of who he is. He's a constant reminder that even in the bleakest night, one person can still make a difference. And that's a story that will never go out of style. What's your favorite era of Batman? The Golden Age detective, the Silver Age adventurer, or the modern Dark Knight? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip through comic book history, be sure to like and subscribe for more.